Test. Microphone also.
Okay.
Switched off. No.
Okay. Well, use this one. Thank you.
Everything okay?
Yep. Thank you.
So, good afternoon. I think we are ready to start. I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Lidi Nakpil. I'm with the Asian People's Movement on Debt and Development, and I'm from the Philippines. And we're going to talk about a topic tonight that is really very central to the lives of people of the South. In fact, the lives of people everywhere, even in the North. And this is about land and climate change. Land is very central to us. It is the source of our life, of our livelihoods, of food. And one of the things that climate change will impact a lot and is already impacting is our lands. From the north to the south, our lands have been visibly impacted by climate change, and thus our livelihoods, our food, our source of life. At the same time, land is also a very significant source of solutions for climate change, the reduction of emissions, because we have come to learn that the way that food, for instance, is being produced by dominant food production systems is contributing a lot to the problem of climate change. So this afternoon, we're very fortunate to have 4 people who will take us to a very rich, what I anticipate to be a very rich discussion about land, climate action, and human rights. Human rights being a very central part of how we should approach land in terms of addressing impacts as well as pursuing land-based solutions. We have 4 speakers, and we will begin with a speaker from MISEREOR, which is the Catholic Bishops' Organization for Development Cooperation here in Germany. He is Stefan Tuschen. May I call on Stefan?
Thanks, Lily, for introducing me and the issue. Before we dig deep into the land dimension of what you just presented, it's my task and pleasure to frame a little bit the whole discussion from the human rights perspective. As an organization active in development cooperation, as you said, our focus is to try to support the poor, the sick, the hungry, and the disadvantaged in the world, or in short, which is the most vulnerable people. And for us, in general, in the work we do, the human rights approach is fundamental and cross-cutting. And hence also what we do in the field of climate change and climate action for us also is a topic of human rights, or it's a human rights issue. And why is that? Because it's, again, as in other areas we work in, it's again the most vulnerable whose rights are infringed first when it comes to consequences of climate change. So before mentioning some of the rights, there are some effects. I guess all of you know what is climate change doing to our world and to our peoples. So some of the effects, and illustrated with some pictures here: temperature rises, which lead to changes in rainfalls and water distribution. We have more frequent droughts. This is a picture just recently taken in Peru after the country was affected by El Nino. So flooding is an issue. This is from the Philippines some years ago when the hurricane hit. No, it's not a hurricane. The hurricanes are in a different, it's a typhoon. Haiyan, yeah. And maybe the last one. Another issue we are also confronted with due to working with people in the Pacific region is that those people are already losing, as you see in this picture, some of their territories. This is an island that belongs to the Carteret Islands, where due to rising sea levels, territory of the people disappears. So maybe back, there's a list of all these, or some of the consequences, and subsequently these consequences, or what the next slides show, is what rights and how, what type of rights are affected. First and foremost, many people are affected by their right, or the right to food, to adequate food is affected, food security. And there is a long list of other fundamental rights that are already today infringed by the consequences of climate change. And there is a danger that in the future this will even get worse. So what we have, when you go to the next slide, please, in the Paris Agreement is, for the first time ever in an environmental accord or agreement, explicit reference to human rights. And there are some of the rights just mentioned are even mentioned here in word, and then again, a whole lot of right holders are also mentioned here, like migrants, children, women, local communities, indigenous peoples. So there is, fortunately, a strong reference to this issue in the Paris Agreement. But now, where we are now, and this is also relevant for what's going on this 2 weeks here in Bonn, is how these rights can be, in the implementation of the agreement, can be also how do you say? How can we take care that the rights are not further or infringed? And what we've seen before is that on the one hand, the consequences or the impacts of climate change are affecting the full enjoyment of these rights. But, and this is kind of setting the stage for what my colleagues are going to present, in this new context of more ambition, setting a 1.5 goal, there is, of course, a need to enhance action and to immediate act on the causes and consequences of climate change. So there is a potential danger if we do these actions wrong, that the rights can be even in the reaction to what is causing climate change, that in the climate action, these rights can be further infringed. So finally, I would like to draw on what the Human Rights and Climate Change Working Group, some of you might be familiar with, has set out to be like 4 entry points here for this session in Bonn. How to integrate the issue of human rights in the further work of the implementation of the Paris Agreement. So it has to be at the core, that's what we as a human rights working group say, has to be at the core of the implementation. There has to be an effort to promote the rights, especially of the most affected, the most impacted. It has to be in line with existing obligations, what the implementation of the Paris Agreement sets out, which means that there is already among parties, among governments, who most of them have signed more than one of the human rights conventions or agreements that exist outside UNFCCC. So there is a strong obligation already to respect and promote human rights. And now when it comes to stronger action and private actors join these actions, there's also a necessity to ensure the accountability of these actors. And I think I'll leave it for now here.
Thank you, Stefan. It is going to be indeed very, very crucial that we look at land-based solutions to climate change, as well as programs that address the impacts of climate change on land from the lens of human rights. We have the next colleague who will speak, Bertrand Noire. I practiced that so I can pronounce it correctly. From Action Against Hunger in France. They have a French name, of course, but I cannot pronounce it. So I'd like to give the floor to Bertrand now.
Thank you, Lydie. So my intervention will be more on food security. So there's a human right, which is the right to food, but in the text of the Paris Agreement, we especially succeeded in putting the wording achieving food security and ending hunger. So we'll begin to talk about it. It's very interesting to be able to have this slot just after the technical expert meeting on agriculture and action in agriculture, where we had a very interesting presentation and especially a few interventions from the room. The one from the indigenous people saying they're afraid to see that mitigation actions in agriculture could threaten their food security or their agricultural systems. And we had another one from India saying that the main focus should be on adaptation rather than mitigation when it's about agriculture. So I'm going to focus on how climate action in agriculture should be based on adaptation for food security and mitigation, particularly through the reduction of methane and nitrous oxide, which are the 2 main gases, non-CO2 gases, emitted by agricultural activities. So let's first begin with food security. Food security is quite complicated, and I thought it might be useful to go back to what it is. So food security is achieved when people have access to sufficient nutritious food to have a healthy life. So it's based on the availability of food, the access, which is economical or physical or financial access, and the quality of the food through the diversity, through the consumption, through the nutrient content. And this should be stable. This should be sustainable all along the year, all along the years. So often the debate when we talk about agriculture and climate change is just how are we going to make sure that agriculture stays productive in the face of climate change? But actually we have to see how it is productive, it is nutritious, it is diversified, it ensures sustainable livelihoods and decent jobs to not have impact on poverty, and also the solutions that are put in place should be sustainable. So, of course, as a humanitarian NGO, when I want to talk about action in agriculture, I talk about adaptation that serves really food security. So I put on this diapo. So adaptation that serves food security in agriculture must be productive, but tackling smallholder farmers, because they are the responsible for 70 to 80% of the food that we eat, and especially in developing countries. The production should be diversified for good nutrition, and they should protect from degradation of soils. It should also be resilient to the impacts of climate change, securing decent jobs in agriculture and in related off-farm activities like in value chains. And the solutions must be long-lasting solutions, not that solutions that would jeopardize the environment to produce more today and to deplete resources for tomorrow. So any action in agriculture should be responding to these three main points. And that's lead us to a main warning. So beware the false solution in agriculture. Here are a few of what most NGOs have been criticizing, few initiatives, which governance is often not clear, and the criteria of exclusion in the kind of practice or the kind of members they have is not clear either. So I put, for example, the Global Alliance for Climate Smart Agriculture, which has projects going from transboundary agroecological practices for livestock to the introduction of GMO seeds, drought tolerant in Tanzania, and destroying the biosafety laws in some countries, supported by Monsanto. There is a nutrient stewardship, which is supposed to improve the use of nutrient and synthetic fertilizers, and which is supported by Yara, for example, or by BASF. The 4 Mil initiatives, which focuses on soil carbon sequestration instead of focusing on what should be done for food security. And the AAA initiative, which was inaugurated at last COP, and which main supporter is the fertilizer industry, which had the monopoly on the fertilizer that they produce, which is phosphate. So the main question about this is that in these initiatives, I'm not saying that everything is bad, and there are very good projects and there are other projects, but in its initiative, the ones who seem to get the biggest share are the big agribusiness. And actually, what I've been, the fact is that big agribusiness and the practices are probably the ones who are the most responsible for agriculture emissions and the impact agriculture has on climate change. So I'll go to the next diapo. So this is a graphic explaining the share of agriculture in greenhouse gas emissions, and more especially, what are the different posts of emission. So when you look in detail at agriculture, the main gases are methane and nitrous oxide. So methane, it comes from enteric fermentation in livestock, in ruminants, the management of manure, the manure left on the soil. It also comes from paddy rice. And then nitrous oxide, it comes from the use of synthetic fertilizers, and also a bit from the management of manure. Actually, the nitrous oxide emissions have been increasing by 30% during the 2 last decades, following an increased use of synthetic fertilizers. So is using synthetic fertilizer a good solution for climate action in agriculture? I can really doubt it. And then the livestock methane emissions have also been increasing in the last decades, but this is more because of a change in consumption patterns where people are eating more meat in many countries, and so this is responsible of an increase in livestock breeding. Yes. So these emissions of methane and nitrous oxide, they really need to be reduced. Many say that, oh, we can't reduce that because it's biologic. Yes, methane comes from the activity of bacteria in the rumen of cows, and nitrous oxide from nitrogen fertilizers come from the denitrification from bacteria in the soil. But actually, you know that if you put 100 kg of nitrogen on the ground, it will emit 1 kg of nitrous oxide. So if you reduce the use of synthetic fertilizer, you will reduce the emissions. And if you find ways to reduce the emissions from enteric fermentation, you can reduce the methane from agriculture, and solutions exist, both in terms of what the kind of the feed you give to the cows and how you integrate the livestock to the crops and to the forest. So this leads us to agroecology. Agroecology, for most of NGOs and many scientists and many farmers and social movements, as all it needs to respond to the prerequisite for adaptation and mitigation. Because you're combining crops to be able to face climate shocks. Like if you have only one crop and there's the bad pest or the bad climate event, it will all be destroyed. But when you are combining different varieties, different crops, trees, different breeds of animals, you kind of make sure that you will not lose everything. So this is resilience. Trees, incorporating trees in the crops or in the pastures also helps retain the soil and build the stocks of organic matter in the soil. So it brings resilience in case of disaster. It also brings carbon, organic matter back in the ground, which has a co-benefit of carbon storage, but only a co-benefit, because we'll talk about it later, but it's not permanent and it's very easy to reverse and emit back into the air. So we really think that agroecology offers a route for transition, whether from smallholder farming, subsistence farming, towards more productivity, but with no bad impacts on the climate, and to move from very productive systems to more integrated ones with lower impacts. Meaning that for some system, it's adaptation with its co-benefits, but for other, it should be mitigation with adaptation co-benefits. And all this is serving food security. So if we have just one recommendation, but I won't be long on this because Teresa will explain much more our recommendation. I just would like to emphasize on the fact that there should be a joint work program on agriculture and food security. Because if there is climate action in agriculture, it must serve food security. And as scientific and technical advice is very useful, but together with implementation, and all this should serve the Paris Agreement, it should involve both the SBSTA, the SBI, and the APA. And I will stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bertrand. As you were talking, I was remembering very vividly all the agro-industrial estates in the Philippines that are probably emitting so high and producing food that is not meant for our people. And these are food that we have to export to the rest of the world because our land, it's also occupying a lot of our land and we're not benefiting from this land at all. Bertrand also mentioned fall solutions. So our next speaker will be tackling one of them. She's Kelly Stone from ActionAid USA and we'll be talking about BECCS.
Thank you, Liddy. I am going to talk about one type of action in the land sector that ActionAid opposes, which is bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, or BECCS. While BECCS is often presented as a net negative emissions technology that would help us limit global warming to 1.5 degrees, it's actually an unproven technology that likely won't deliver anywhere close to the emission savings promised and presents a significant risk to human rights, particularly food security and land tenure rights. So despite these risks, BECCS is heavily embedded in our climate models and pathways and is being used as a crutch to avoid hard conversations about the ambition gap that we're facing. So ActionAid's opposition to BECCS is rooted in concerns about food security and land tenure rights, as I mentioned. We have a long-standing position on opposing food and land-based bioenergy, especially on a large scale, because of the impacts we've seen in the communities we work in. Demand for bioenergy creates a demand for large-scale biomass plantations. The market then works very hard to meet that demand, which puts increasing pressure on smallholder farmers and also increases the risk of even land grabs. What I mean when I talk about a land grab is essentially a family or sometimes a whole community is kicked off their land, which means they lose their income, their primary source of food, and their home, often all in one swoop. During the last biofuels expansion that we saw earlier in the 2000s, we saw 17 million hectares of land grabbed for bioenergy between 2002 and 2012. That is a very conservative number of large land grabs that we're able to trace back specifically to bioenergy projects, and not just flex crops that often become bioenergy projects. So since this issue has been discussed in recent years, there has been increasing acknowledgement, even from those using BECCS in their models, of the need to address this potential food security and land rights risks. However, just acknowledging that there is a risk does not make it easy to fix. The IPCC in AR5 included this graph which captured estimates within published research about the land use requirements for BECCS. And the estimates range from 500 million hectares to about 3 billion hectares, with one outlier of 6 billion. To give you a sense of the scale of what that amount of land actually means, 500 million hectares is slightly larger than the country of India. 1.5 million hectares is the current total land devoted to agriculture, and 3 billion hectares is roughly the size of the African continent. So we only have one planet, as we often hear, which means not only that there is no do-over on climate action, but also that we only have one planet worth of land. And so we have to start treating land as a limited resource, which it is, and take seriously what is the best use of the limited land that we have. Because we need to not only look at agriculture and food security, but also where people are living, the needs for infrastructure, and the climate action like ecosystem restoration, which Therese is going to talk about more in a minute. So beyond the human rights risks, there's also a concern that BECCS won't deliver on the promised climate benefit. The climate benefits from BECCS depends on the idea that biomass is a carbon neutral source of energy. And so that combined with carbon capture and storage, it's a net negative emissions technology. But we cannot make a blanket assumption that burning biomass is carbon neutral. There are emissions at the stack when you burn anything. Advocates have argued that regrowing biomass offsets those emissions, but this often isn't the case when you capture the full life cycle emissions of energy. This is particularly true for something like woody biomass, where it can take decades or longer to regrow trees cut and burned for bioenergy, and it's often difficult to ever fully restore previously untouched forests to their full sequestration potential. Additionally, if biomass production is displacing another land use, say agriculture, emissions resulting from the conversion of other forests or grasslands to agriculture to make up for that lost land to bioenergy production should also be counted as emissions resulting from bioenergy. On top of the concerns about bioenergy's carbon neutrality, there's a question about whether or not this technology will work at scale, period, particularly in the time frame that we needed in the climate models. We have found no evidence of a BECCS plant anywhere in the world right now using woody biomass as an energy source, anywhere. Pairing carbon capture technology with woody biomass is not necessarily going to be easy. The composition of the emissions when you burn woody biomass is different than when you're burning coal. So a different technology is needed to capture those emissions and store them. And that's setting aside all of the other questions that are rightfully being raised about CCS. So what we have in BECCS is a technology that hasn't really been developed yet, that depends on a faulty carbon neutrality assumption to offer any climate benefits, and presents huge risks to human rights. And yet, BECCS is a key part of many, if not most, climate models and pathways, with large-scale deployment in some cases as early as the 2030s. This doesn't make any sense when you think about the uncertainties and the risks. In fact, we've continued to see reliance on BECCS even when these risks are acknowledged. And I have quotes here from the IPCC and from the US Mid-Century Strategy talking about how these uncertainties are a risk. And you can see that actually the US refers back to, well, the IPCC relied on it. The IPCC saying, well, there are technological challenges and risks. We're not certain. So why are these models everywhere that are relying on BECCS so heavily? And what I have found is that BECCS is being used as a crutch to avoid talking about the true size and scale of the ambition and emissions gap. I'm going to put up another graph and talk you through this a little bit. So if negative emissions technologies can be deployed at scale in the future, that means that the emissions reductions and the transitions away from fossil fuels can take longer, but still reach the same ultimate goal. This is essentially why they are appealing. It makes the transition easier because we can go more slowly. So if you look at this graph, this was published in Science in 2016, and this graph is representative of it's a median of the 76 IPCC scenarios that are most closely matching the Paris Agreement goals. So if you look at the black line, that's the emissions pathway. And the shape of this line is something we're all kind of familiar with. Peaking, followed by a reduction, followed by net negative emissions in the later half of the century. What these authors found when they unpacked these models further is that the mitigation from moving away from fossil fuels and stopping land use emissions is actually in this pink line that you can see is actually above where the black is. And that the way we actually reach the goals set by the black line mitigation pathways is by relying on these realized negative emissions, which you can see starting in the 2030s. And so what happens is because we are counting on these negative emissions, it makes the mitigation path easier. But we don't know if these negative emission technologies will work. We certainly don't know if they will work by 2030, and we certainly don't know if they will work at the scale that is being called for in these models. But we're using we're using BECCS as a crutch to avoid talking about the really hard decisions that it would take to move that pink line closer to the black one. And so we are gambling that there will be a solution, BECCS or something else, with an acceptable cost presenting itself at the right time in order to make this model work. But what we're gambling with is people's lives. Because if we are wrong and we are on the pink line and we aren't realizing all of those negative emissions because the technology is not available or because the cost is unacceptable, then we leave ourselves in a much worse situation than if we were being honest with ourselves and talking about the hard choices right now. I think I will leave it at that.
Okay, thank you, Kelly. We're now going to move on to the live policy fights that are happening in Bonn and in the months coming. And for that, there has been recently issued a very, very good briefer. I'm praising it because we're also supporting this briefer on the policy issues in Bonn and the recommendations. And we're very lucky this evening to have with us the person mainly responsible for getting it done. So Teresa Anderson from ActionAid will give an overview of the briefer and the recommendations.
Thanks. Hi. Oh, that's probably not near enough, is it? Okay, there we go. Hi. Yeah, I just need one. It's okay. Hi, everyone. Yes, so you've heard quite a lot here about these issues of human rights, the importance of food security, and what we want to see and what we don't want to see. How, you know, the threats, the potential false solutions to climate change that could end up undermining human rights and food security instead of actually serving them. So how do we pull that all together, and what does it mean for these climate negotiations? Because I think certainly as NGOs, and there are probably some negotiators here as well, but as NGOs, we find it really easy to talk about the problems and the solutions, but it's always really hard to link it into the negotiations themselves. So we've tried really hard to try to think now how to use this opportunity with the Paris Agreement agreed, but still the rules not yet being in place. How can we really get a foothold for some of these issues that we want to flag? So now I'm going to do probably the boring bit, but you're going to pay close attention because this is how you're going to translate these ideas into all your conversations, either as negotiators or as civil society or researchers. So thank you in advance for all your efforts to make this happen. So this briefing, yes, you can see there has been signed, a lot of these organizations took part in writing the briefing as well. And really, a lot of these organizations are agriculture groups like those of us on this panel here, but also forest groups, because the land issue is really not only about forest and not only about land. And these two issues really intersect a lot. And forest groups, we find, and agriculture groups often have in the past disagreed on the best way to talk about land. So as CLARA, as the Climate, Land, Ambition and Rights Alliance, we've begun these last few years to really try to sit together and think, what do we agree on? What do we really want action in the land sector to look like? And what don't we want it to look like? And we discovered that actually we agree. When we get down to the detail, we really agree on a lot of stuff. And actually we can really come up with a holistic approach if we get down to it. And so that's what this briefing is about. And I strongly encourage you to pick one up either here or at the Global Forest Coalition stand in the corridor over there, where you can sort of learn more about it. And so this presentation is about the food security aspect, as you will have realized, but other colleagues will be presenting at a later date about the forest and ecosystem aspect, which I strongly, suggest you listen to if you're interested. So I'll first of all talk about the post-Paris context and why we felt this was such a need and such an opportunity to change the discussion, and also to recognize that things are a little bit different now to how they were pre-Paris, and we need to slightly change our assumptions on how to approach some of these issues. So the inclusion of developing countries in the Paris Agreement, means that things are different now from how they were with the Kyoto Protocol, when it was developed countries who had the responsibility for emission reductions. Now developing countries have taken on the responsibility too. What does that mean? Well, actually, because fewer developing countries have industrialized economies, it means that for most developing countries, their emission reductions, their climate action is going to be more in the land sector And so that has significant implications for how they approach all of this mitigation work. And it really highlights the need to think of fair and equitable approaches because, in fact, historically, most emissions, we have a climate crisis because we have failed to address emission reductions in the north. And so we need to be really aware of the risks of putting large burdens on the south for carrying these emission reductions responsibilities and what the implications could be on their land sector. So this is a new context, a new issue in the post-Paris context that we really have to be aware of and not just talk about land sector in general, but be sensitive to these real equity issues. We also need to note that actions are voluntary. So countries, if they're cautious about what their action should be because of their human rights and food security implications, they should be able to say no. They're not obliged to do things that will undermine their own food security and human rights. And developing countries should bear that concept in mind when they enter these negotiations, because they should be aware of the risks, but also aware that these actions are voluntary and they don't have to be forced into them if they don't want to be. We also really feel it's time to say it, and to say it clearly, and for everybody else to say it clearly as well. There is simply no carbon budget available for offsetting. Now, in the Kyoto Protocol, basically this idea that countries in the north could avoid reducing their emissions by paying countries in the south to do mitigation activities. Well, now you've got both north and south doing mitigation activities. So first of all, from a developing country perspective, why would they want to sell you their offset cheaply when they actually have to use it themselves for their own NDC, nationally determined contribution? So the availability of offsets itself should end up being very limited, and we shouldn't be structuring our mitigation activities on these assumptions anyway. But also, just look at how far we are from the 1.5 pathway, right? We need actions in all sectors. We need action in the land sector, yes, but we also need maximum action in the industrial sector. And we shouldn't be saying you should be let off the hook from action in other sectors if you do action in the land sector. If we agree this is a climate crisis and we're not on target for the 1.5 goal, then we need action in all sectors, which means no offsetting. And I think everyone needs to go away and really internalize this and think about what it means. And this is our chance to really kick offsetting out of the, the delusions of offsetting, out of the climate discourse and address that huge problem. And then we also need to recognize there's a big opportunity here in the Paris Agreement, because the preamble made very clear, as Stefan, I think, put up the language earlier, about the Paris Preamble has specific obligations on food security and human rights, and it needs to safeguard these, which means that because it's in the preamble, it means it needs to guide every single article in the whole of the Paris Agreement needs to be operationalizing those preambular conditions on food security and human rights. So our challenge now is to think about, when we develop the rules for implementation of the Paris Agreement, particularly and as these discussions are held in the ad hoc working group on the Paris Agreement, or the APA, this is an opportunity for us to start to make this real. So I'm going to go through some of the recommendations. I mean, just so you know, the briefing has sections on what climate action in the land sector should look like, and also what it shouldn't look like, as well as policy recommendations as well. So that can help guide the thinking. But once you've read all of that, then you'll understand why we're making these recommendations. So in Substat Agriculture, I don't know if any of you follow that negotiating track, but it's been pretty stuck for a pretty long time. As we all know, one of the reasons why there's been this big tension, largely between North and South countries, is because There's a lot of pressure for mitigation action, particularly in agriculture and including for developing countries. But developing countries feel that adaptation is their priority. And most of them say, we weren't the ones to cause the problem in the first place. Why should we sacrifice our food security? We need more support on adaptation instead. So there's been this adaptation mitigation battle really going on that hasn't progressed in the last 4 years, unfortunately. So we think that it's time to think a little bit more granularly about this and try to find ways to really penalize those countries that are most responsible for agricultural emissions, which are the ones with heavily industrialized agriculture, which is mostly developed countries and a few large agricultural developing countries, but the majority are not the ones responsible. And also, so that would be by tackling non-CO2 emissions in agriculture, the methane and nitrous oxide that Bertrand talked about. And it would also, sorry, I've skipped ahead, haven't I? So what we want is for SBSTA to develop a work program on agriculture and food security. And we think that is something that we can ask SBSTA to do, and something that they could consider even would be for it to be a joint SBSTA SBI work program with the specific linkages to the APA, as Bertrand talked about. And so there it should talk about adaptation as a major focus, because that is really what developing countries' priorities are. But if it's going to talk about mitigation, it needs to be, really acknowledging the role of non-CO2 emissions. And this has been not part of the agriculture discourse. Everyone's obsessed with soil carbon sequestration, but that has a lot of problems. And really the real issue is methane and nitrous oxide. And so we need to address these. And really, the other role of the SBSTA Agriculture Work Programme could be to make clear recommendations to the APA transparency discussions so that food security and human rights can be safeguarded. And SBSTA could be reminding APA of this responsibility to ensure the Paris Agreement preamble elements. Another piece is this, in the discussion on markets and non-market mechanisms under SBSTA, that should just acknowledge that there is no room for offsetting. And also, where there are carbon markets, they definitely shouldn't be including new land use activities. And then under the APA, we'd love it if there were some APA transparency negotiators in this room, but probably there aren't. But they need to be hearing this from anyone who meets an APA transparency person. Grab them and talk to them about the importance of food security being in the transparency framework, because we want them to think of a way to ensure reporting or criteria to safeguard food security and human rights in climate action. It's not only, this transparency framework should not only be about accounting emissions or accounting on finance, which is also important, but really these other very critical elements of human rights and food security. And as APA gives guidance for emissions and removals, as countries submit their NDCs, we really want that land sector NDCs to include information so that they can, be telling the UNFCCC and reassuring everyone that they really are thinking about these food security, human rights issues, as well as ecosystem integrity. So those are our recommendations on agriculture. But if you want to hear about the parts on forests and ecosystems, be here same time next week, because Greenpeace and Rainforest Foundation Norway will talk about part 2 of the briefing, and they'll go into more detail about really the massive potential to contribute to the 1.5 degree target if we really take seriously the potential to protect and restore degraded ecosystems. There's a lot of potential there that hasn't really been talked about and explored. And actually the best way to do that is also by ensuring land rights, human rights, indigenous people's rights in forests. And they'll go into that in more detail. So in conclusion, action in the land sector has a lot of mitigation potential, but we really need to take great care to ensure that food security and human rights are protected and not threatened by climate actions. The APA process is critical opportunity to develop the rules for Paris and to provide guidance for actions. So I urge you. Sorry, I urge you to pick up this report, which is called Trading Carefully. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Teresa. So we have about 40 minutes for an open discussion. You can ask questions. You can also give your own comments and thoughts on the topics. But when you speak, please do introduce yourself. I think there's a square box there, box-looking thing there for catch box for our microphone, right? Okay, so the floor is now open. Comments, questions, don't be shy. Yes. Claire, here, over here.
Yeah.
Okay.
Where should I speak here? Hi, everybody. My name is Zina Balawi. I work for the Moroccan Council of Human Rights, who has been in charge of civil society poll activities last year in the Moroccan presidency. Sorry. So I have just one comment and one question. My comment, first comment will go to Bertrand about the initiative AAA. This is an initiative who has not been launched in COP22. It has been done much before during an international meeting that we organized in Morocco, which is much more African meeting. And it has been done in consensus with at least 16 African countries, because as you know, sometimes when these global solutions are proposed, they do not take in consideration some specificities. And this initiative was developed by the National Institute of Agronomy, and it takes one of the main objectives is water scarcity. As you know, Morocco is really one country which is, much more affected by the impacts of climate change, much more so. We are much more worried about adaptation and this kind of solutions. So the company of fertilizers is Moroccan one. It's linked because it's it's natural, but maybe I can put you in contact with people who developed this concept and who are now running to make it in application. So I can share with you the contacts. But the question that I have is that, as I said, I work for the Moroccan Council of Human Rights, and before I was in this world of science and IPCC and reports and climate change science, and I was thinking that I know the truth about climate change by this data, scientific data, but I discovered there is a much bigger word, which is the word of human rights. And when I came to this side event, I was wondering if it's possible to link climate change to human rights, but also to link the word of human rights to climate change. I discovered I can give you an example of the issue of migration and how it's, in human rights, they did at least a decade of analysis of advocacy with the human rights instruments, and how can they give the statute of refugees to a migrant, climate migrants. So how can we, I'm just wondering and asking this question to everybody, how can we think to include human rights in Paris Agreement, and this is very well, but also how can we bring the climate to human rights discussions and instruments, and this will reinforce at least the action for human rights in general. Thank you.
Okay, before we ask our panelists to respond, maybe we can take one or two more questions or comments.
Yeah, you can
Thanks. Hi, my name is Marcus from the Center for International Forestry Research. I just wanted to ask, you mentioned a little bit about land. I came a little late, so I missed a bit also. You might have already addressed this, but you mentioned land investments and bioenergy, and you were talking about dispossession in terms of people being displaced, and that was sort of the human rights angle to it. One of the things that we're finding in our research is that there's a sort of a counter narrative coming especially from those who promote land investments, saying that this is a way of addressing underinvestment in rural areas. And in a lot of instances, a lot of rural communities are actually very positive to these sorts of investments because they come with promises of jobs and increased incomes and so on. But what happens is often that the jobs that are created are very few. They offer very little pay, insecure contracts, hazardous work environments, and leads to the exploitation of especially women's labor force. So I was just wondering if any of you in this sort of taking this angle to this issue have looked at the labor aspect of it.
Labor aspect. Okay, we have another question here.
Thank you. My name is Dinda from Solidaritas Perempuan Indonesia, and also the part of women groups. Actually, what has been presented here by the presenter is really also reflected in our experiences in Indonesia. For example, we also have this smart climate agriculture and also like palm oil for the biofuel that really suffering our people there and giving a very bad impact. And I really support with some recommendation that come up that about the safeguard, for example, and how the developing country also more need the adaptation actions. And I would like to add that how we can also propose that the action have to be designed based on practices or initiative and also knowledge and experiences by the community, because we know that the community, they are who are has been preserved the nature and also already have their initiative to preserve the nature, because they see the nature as a livelihood, not only about the trees and about the land. And I also would like to that we need to acknowledge about the different situation, different capacity, and also different impact of the climate change, for example, to women, to indigenous people, and also to other vulnerable groups. So whenever we like designing or proposing the safeguard, or we also design the actions, it has to be considered that different capacity and also situation. Thank you.
We'll stop now and ask our panelists. Sorry. We'll ask our panelists to respond, and then we'll take another group of questions and comments. So maybe the first, human rights and...
Yeah, I think to respond to your question, within the working group I mentioned, the Human Rights and Climate Change Working Group, there is quite a group of people who focus on the UNFCCC, but there's also people who work more Geneva-based and with the Council on Human Rights, the Human Rights Council, the Office of the High Commissioner, the special procedures. And my perception is that in the last years, probably to say, that also within the human rights procedures, there has been a rising awareness for the topic of climate change. So I think we're kind of narrowing from both sides the two issues, but probably your perception is also right, that there is still there's still room for both sides to get these issues together. But I think the recent years have shown that there's quite some movement in this direction going on. And of course, with the topic of migration you mentioned, this is still something that is going to need more attention in the next years or next month. And I think with the reference to this special group of affected people within the Paris Agreement, there's also quite a good anchor to go on working with this or towards this issue. I don't know if anyone else wants to comment.
On this one? No.
Yeah, on the three questions.
Okay. So thank you, Mrs. Badawi, for the information on the AAA. It's very interesting. I was just surprised, and many of us were, that at the inauguration event, if it's not the launching event that there was at COP22, the Ministry of Agriculture of Morocco heavily thanks the director of the Official Évian des Phosphates for its very great contribution in the AAA. And this is just another piece of the puzzle in a long, long series where you see that private interests are taking a lot of part of all these initiatives, and that solutions that really don't seem to be the good ones for climate action in agriculture are promoted and are gaining a lot of attention from the negotiators and from other companies and etc. And this is really worrying for us to see that the solutions that needs little investment and that are people-centered and would really benefit the most vulnerable one are not the ones that are praised in public policies and in these kind of events. I'd like to comment also on the C4 question. Sorry, I didn't get your name right. We didn't work on the labor issues linked to this, but my NGO is also looking into the growth corridors initiatives in Africa, and for example, the one in Burkina Faso, in Bagré. And it is supposed to be done in the context of the new Alliance for Food Security and Nutrition. And then you see that the one who would need more help, which are the smallholder farmers, they are evicting from their land. And the Bagré corridor, it's famous for having evicted thousands of people from their land to produce food, which is, as Lydie said earlier, not even consumed in the country, but for export. And about the Linda one, I would just say that when we talk about agroecology, agroecology is not how to say it? I have the idea in French. Say it in French. Clé en main. It's not no. Yeah. It's not like a model which is very defined and you can apply everywhere. It's based on local knowledge, indigenous knowledge, locally available solutions, what the varieties that have been developed by the farmers themselves. There's a movement behind agroecology, social movement, and they are working on sharing experiences between the farmers and looking for these solutions which are highly adaptable and highly based on what the communities could do and the resources they can access, actually. I don't know if it answers.
Oh, that was clear. Yeah, the lady just left on human rights, but I thought I would talk a little bit about the migration question anyway, since she flagged it up. And of course, it is sort of the next stage in it's an issue that's very integrated with human rights. We saw, for example, last year with the El Nino drought that hit really severely across the world in 2015, 2016. I'm not sure if many people are aware, but during that El Nino drought, 30% of the planet was affected by drought last year. 30% of the planet. And it barely made it into the public consciousness. And this was the year following Paris, when the whole world had cried tears of sadness and joy over the Paris Agreement, and yet here they were ignoring an actual global climate crisis. Anyway, but so that we saw massive migration, actually, for example, in India, resulting from the El Nino drought. And we've seen, like in South Asia and parts of the world, West Africa, migration is a massive issue, but it's not really being linked to climate change in the public discourse. And I think it's something that we do need to talk about generally, because, you know, migration and refugees are becoming a global political issue, but that's not being linked to climate change or human rights. And it's a massive gap that many of our organizations are looking into right now and looking to fill, because we really need to link that human rights issue with that climate refugee issue. and the loss and damage negotiations in the Warsaw International Mechanism, which is under the UNFCCC, but not being talked about at SBSTA, but there's another regular process that goes on throughout the year. They currently have a task force on displacement, and they're talking about these issues. And I think the content of the conversation is quite good, but we'll see if anything, comes out of it. Of course, a lot of this depends on the political will of developed countries to support initiatives and to provide financial support, including that. And that all remains to be seen if it will happen. But of course, we need to keep up the pressure. And on the points that Linda raised, you also made me realize there was another aspect that I should have or could have mentioned, and that will come out more clearly next week in the part 2 presentation. But one of the things we want to see in action in the land sector is the full and effective participation of stakeholders, rights holders, right from the start, and not just when a country decides that they want to do a project and then they design it, they design a policy, they design a project, and then they choose where they're going to do it and what it's going to look like. And then at the last minute, they ask the local community, do you like this? And the community goes, no, what are you talking about? And they go, oh, well, that's inconvenient. We'll ignore what you said, but we've consulted you, so that's fine. No, we want those communities, those are stakeholders to be involved right at the very beginning in the design phase of policies and projects. And this is what needs to be challenged, and done in a different way from what we've seen before.
So I'm going to focus mostly on the bioenergy questions, but I do think around the implementation needs to be owned by the communities that are doing the implementing. Otherwise, the climate action is never going to work, either for the communities or for the climate. On palm oil, it's a really tough one, but palm oil biodiesel in particular is terrible for the climate. The climate impacts are horrific, and it's leading to all of the negative impacts on communities that you would expect with large-scale bioenergy production. So I think safeguards, yes, safeguards is important, making sure that projects are community-led, making sure that human rights are at the core of implementing climate action. But I also think that means in the North, we need to tackle demand. So we need to really be looking at our policies that are incentivizing the importation of palm oil from Southern countries, whether for our processed food or for our biodiesel. On the question around bioenergy, you're absolutely right. It's really difficult. The narrative of underinvestment in rural areas is often true. That's one of the reasons that ActionAid works with communities on advocating for public financing in agriculture to reach smallholder farmers so that they're getting support from their governments to make their agricultural practices more resilient, so that they have better control over the means of input to actually grow their food, and so that they are reaching towards and achieving food sovereignty. On the promises that we have seen the same thing is that companies come in with promises that, there'll be jobs and this is a good thing for you and that, you will be better off. And then that the reality is often that people are losing their land. People who didn't want to sell their land are under extreme pressure, sometimes physically blocked from accessing their land, to the point where because they can't grow anything, because they can't get there to work, that they then are forced to sell. Compensation is almost never commensurate to, never matches the actual value of the land that's being sold under pressure, particularly because land for these smallholder farmers is really their security and investment in the future. This is how they get their food. This is what this is how they're going to be able to afford school fees for their children. This is their security, and they're coming up with a cash payment to replicate that is never going to really be feasible. We have found that communities often see through these promises, but that there is lots of work to do in building up resilient livelihoods in rural areas and in other parts of the developing countries, so that communities are secure in their rights and also have livelihoods that are keeping them secure, that are keeping, you know, food on the table, keeping their kids in school, giving them a better life. And so it's a tricky issue, but you really got to look at the full package of livelihoods to get to the core of this issue.
Before I hand the microphone to Bertrand, because he has a point about migration, I'd also just like to add, of course, there are many movements in the South fighting these issues on the ground. And one of the things that we said we will be working for is to have a greater presence and voice of Southern movements here in the negotiation so they can talk directly about these issues. And just on the migration, also to add that there's also initiatives in the South to raise the issue of climate-induced migration and climate refugees. Now, there's a current debate which category we will, or term we will be using, but to bring it here at the international level as well. So Bertrand?
Yes, so just a very quick point on that, because it's not the topic of the event. Climate forced displacement, people who are suffering for this face the fact that there is no really clear legal protection on that, and there's no refugee status. It doesn't apply to environmental refugees. It's not a legal status. But during the past few years, there was an international initiative called the Nansen Initiative, and they developed a protection agenda for disaster displaced people. So if you're really interested in this issue, I would advise you to look for this protection agenda from the Nansen Initiative. And then there's a platform on this, which is called the PDD, Displaced People Platform. So it's not this Disaster Displacement Platform, DDP, sorry. And it's all in the internet.
Okay, thank you. I think we still have time for another round of 2 or 3 questions or comments, and then the final word from our panelists after that. Yes? Yeah,
I have a question.
Yeah,
Yes.
and then throw it there after you finish. Okay.
Okay, my name is Bernice. I work for Southern Voices of Adaptation and ANAC in Nicaragua. And we work for straining capacities of people that are being affected for sugarcane. And the thing that we're seeing in the communities is that sugarcane is becoming bigger. They're making more money, and the communities are being more poor, and they're migrating to the north part of Nicaragua, causing big deforestation. So it's a problem that is affecting deforestation and affecting the land. And we came to the conclusion that the point of all this problem is economic activities. And my question is how you approaching the economic model discussion, how you approaching this discussion, and have there been resources to promote agroecology? And I want to know if there's a successful example that you could talk about that agroecology, and that's my question. The economic model and the economic activities, how you approach this. Thank you.
Okay, we have 3 more, so very quickly there. And then our colleague from there, and our Maureen over here, and then another one. If you just make very short 1 minute comments or questions, so we can speak before we have the last one.
Thank you very much. My name is Sabina Voogd. I work for a Dutch development NGO called Both Ends. And I want to make a comment about the relation between human rights and climate change, because it is in the preamble of Paris Agreement, but that's non-binding. So we still have to push a bit harder there to get the human rights recognized. And in the human rights realm, you see that it's mainly used to recognize the problems that people have because of climate change. Their right to food, their right to clean environment. There are lots of reports from special rapporteurs. Maybe there can be complaints can be filed, but not very much is happening because it's a big paper circus, actually, the human rights realm. So what solution could we get? I think the work of the Mary Robinson Foundation is really interesting in this. They are looking at the relation between climate change and human rights, and they're looking at procedural human rights, the right to have information, the right to participate, And these are rights that actually can help you to get some action on climate change. As a final remark, I want to say that in the Netherlands, there was a group of citizens who sued their government because the government was not protecting them against the effects of climate change. And the miraculous thing was that the judge actually said, yes, that's true. So I ordered the Dutch government to take measurements to help the Dutch people. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Gideon Sanago from Tanzania. My question goes to second presenter who focused on food security. And would you please clarify something related to, you mentioned about the false agricultural companies, and then you mentioned about, again, Tanzania, and about those companies, one of it are Monsanto's. And if you are aware, is that now in Tanzania we have what we call the Southern Agricultural Corridors of Tanzania, SAGOT. And these projects evicted pastoralists from their ancestral land. And one of the companies that are supporting the SAGOT are Monsanto's. So please, would you please clarify about that? Thank you.
Hello, I'm Maureen Santos. I'm from Brazil and from Raio, Brazil, and also for a collective that's Belém Leather Group. My question is for you. Sorry, I forget your name. And about, yeah, okay. Thank you. First, congratulations for this document. It's amazing, Travis, and for all the group that. It's only about the last part of the presentation. I think I already arrived in this point. Don't you think if we include agroecology in this methodology that we already know that's connect with mitigation opportunities, that generally we saw in the negotiations that these mitigation opportunities mean more market approach, may not be a good idea. It can also be a trick that we have to be aware. I'm talking about that because in Brazil we have the same kind of discussion, and we are seeing that we know that agroecology is the best for water, is the best for the land, is the best for income, is the best for everything, and we defend as a revolutionary for agriculture. But at the same time, if you take the agroecology, start to use the same methodologies as other mitigation cost benefits, and still the same names that you saw in the climate smart agriculture and other issues that remains like that, we start to show that agroecology is even perfect to capture and sequestration of carbon. And I don't think this is the point that we should. And we already have a lot of indicators, methodology, traditional logic that prove already that's good, and using other kinds of indicator. So it's only, I think it's a very important debate that you have to think about it. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Naomi Campbell. I'm from the Mary Robinson Foundation. So thanks to Sabina there for highlighting our good work, which is great. And the report she's talking about is called The Rights to Action. So thanks a million. Actually, the point I had was, and I'm not sure who to address it to, but I suppose, and it's been mentioned, it's about the importance of participation and the integration of local and traditional and indigenous knowledge. And I think that's really important. And I'd be interested to hear how each of you are doing that in your work. That's really, really interesting. And the other point which has come up, I think, throughout the discussion, which I think is really, really important, is gender. And, you know, when we talk about local communities and we talk about, you know, agents of change, women, especially women smallholder farmers, are really at the forefront of that. And, you know, we don't want to create any additional burden on them in that area. So yeah, it was just to kind of touch on those two topics and see what people had to say. Thank you.
Over there. And you catch it. Throw.
You can throw. Hello, my name is Yves Lador from Earth Justice and also part of the GECO, which is the Geneva Climate Change Consultative Group, a group of NGOs working in Geneva on the issue of human rights and climate change. First thing, I want to thank you for the event and for the quality of the presentation on an issue which is not very easy to grasp. So once again, really thank you for the work which is done. One small point on what Benoit said, and probably I'm sure he'll agree with me on that. It is true that we don't have any convention on environmental refugees as such, where you could apply the notion of refugees. But people who are moving in a way or another, being displacement or transboundary migration, have rights. We have to be very careful, all of us, when we talk about this, never to say, oh, these people don't have rights because there's no convention on refugee. No. They have rights because that's exactly what we hear on the borders and so on. No, you're just migrant, you don't have rights. That's not true. All human beings have fundamental rights, all of them, and we must repeat again and again, they have rights. The authorities very often don't apply their obligations according to these rights. So that's the main issue. They have rights, and we have to remind all the authorities about that. Last point about the human rights system. Of course, it's paperwork, but coming from the human rights system, I don't see how the climate change system is less paperwork than the human rights system. And I could go on many other issues, even at the national level, sometimes when we see our own mechanisms. What is interesting is to see that the special rapporteurs can do field visits. That has an impact in the countries. Sometimes it has helped even inside governments because it has given more strength to ministries who have difficulty to get their message through at the top of the government. So there are mechanisms that can be used by everybody. And for example, there are clear links with the work which can be done at the national level. We see that with what's going on today in the Philippines, with the complaint that has been done in front of the National Filipinos Commissioner for Human Rights. And we see that the commissioners are also looking for information from the human rights system to see how they can deal and how they will answer and go with this complaint. So it's a whole system that we have to use in different ways. Thank you very much again.
Thank you. Thank you for all who gave their comments and their questions. And now we're going to ask our panel to respond, and also respond in a way as giving their last word. We are giving each of them 2 minutes to do that. Thank you.
Yeah, I can start. So thank you everyone again for the wonderful questions. So on the question about sugarcane, so I actually was able to meet with some local partners in Brazil, where there was a community that was at the center of the community practicing agroecology. They were organized into a collective. They came together to buy a truck. They sold their produce to local schools and local markets that were particularly set up by the government to help feed women and children. And it is exactly what you'd want a community who's practicing agroecology to look like. They were working together. It was working as an economic model. They were very proud of their food production. What was happening is they were being slowly surrounded by sugarcane. And the sugarcane companies came in with promises of jobs that never materialized. Many of the workers ended up being migrants whose rights were also at risk. And because the pesticides were being sprayed, those who were living on the edges of the community were really struggling to grow any food at all. And so I was really struck when I was there at the extreme examples of, if we let communities and support communities in doing what they know how to do and what they want to do, they will flourish, and it will benefit the climate, and they will benefit their food security and their livelihoods. But if we continue forcing this industrial model on them, then we will end up with bad solutions for communities and bad solutions for the climate. And that's actually my lasting point, is that I spend a lot of time in this space talking about BECCS and ambition and bioenergy. But what this really all comes down to, despite the graphs and the technical terms, are political decisions that we are making. We are making political decisions about the climate action we will pursue and how quickly we are going to pursue it. And however much we are hiding that behind technical jargon, we're making political decisions about how hot the earth is going to get, what the impacts are going to be for people, and whose lives and livelihoods are going to be at stake. And so I think that when it comes to human rights in the climate change space, if you are always coming back to those questions, you're able to cut through many of the graphs and technical jargons and get to the heart of the political decisions that we're making today. So I will leave it at that. Thank you, everyone.
Hi, yeah. So I think I'll start with the more technical issues before I go to the broader one, which is, Maureen, your question on should we talk about the role of agroecology for mitigation? It is very complex, and I think Bertrand just had one slide and we didn't have a chance to go into it in great detail. But broadly, yeah, I do agree with you that talking about certainly talking about soil carbon sequestration from agroecology is a slippery slope, partly because of ideas that Bertrand touched on, that it's very hard to measure soil carbon sequestration. And actually, but we do know that agroecology is good because it avoids the use of fertilizers, synthetic fertilizers, and so actually reduces those non-CO2 emissions. And also, if we have a small scale and local and non-intensive meat production or livestock production, that's also going to make a big difference. So we do want to talk about it. We want to find a way to incentivize the right kind of agriculture and penalize the wrong kind of agriculture. And we didn't have a lot of time to go into it, but our way to thinking of doing that is to really focus on those non-CO2 emissions. And thereby agroecology will sort of come through as the benefit, because if you add manure and composting and mulching instead of synthetic fertilizer, then you'll still get good results. But really, what we do as ActionAid, and I don't know if you realize, but I also work for ActionAid as well. It's our main strategy for adaptation. So we work with farmers, and we really talk about, and farmers are just really fascinated and convinced that using agroecological techniques makes a massive difference to their capacity to adapt, because it actually just really improves the soil, and the soil holds much more water in the face of drought. And even when there's heavy rains and floods, the plants are much stronger as well. So it's really a tool for resilience. It does have, I'm going to admit it does have mitigation co-benefits, but we just don't talk about them. We don't measure them because you can't really make realistic numbered claims. So that's the way we approach it. On the issue of human rights impacts from climate change, I would say, yeah, the consequences of climate change on human rights are much more elaborated, but what we're trying to talk about here and draw also attention to is the consequences of false solutions to climate change on human rights. And I think that that's something that needs to be elaborated a lot more in the human rights discourse. And then on the question of the women's role in our approach to agroecology and communities, certainly when in our programmatic approach on adaptation and agroecology is like we have a very, very gender-focused role, and it's very much about women's empowerment. It's not just about training farmers to be farmers, but it's actually about the whole pathway of empowerment and leadership, so that women can really make much stronger decisions and be the leaders in their community. And we find that those benefits, when women are applying those practices and leading on these activities, and the community benefits much more, and they're much more integrated into the whole community functioning. And it's been really, well, it's fantastic. I really enjoy seeing it, and so I'm sure that this is the kind of thing that you want to see, and I think it's something that lots of adaptation processes could be learning from as well.
Yes, so most has been said already. So just I think that if we talk about the potential of mitigation, it should, as Teresa said, not be accounted for, or not be in a market approach, be in a non-market approach, because this is where the trouble could come for sure. And so this is something that we think about. It's not what we want to do with it is not really clear yet. To Bernice on the agroecology, is it successful? Yes, it is. I mean, it's been proven in many different contexts. There's a study which is a bit old now, which is from 2006, Pretty and al. And it reviews some resource conservation techniques, which are agroecological practices. And it shows that in Asia and in Sub-Saharan Africa, it switching to these techniques from subsistence agriculture, traditional agriculture, to these techniques, which are really low tech, you could get a 80 to 160% increase in your productivity, not damaging the environment. So there's many studies, and you'll find many things about agroecology, and the main thing has to be put in this context. You cannot it's not a ready to use a solution, so it needs to be put back in its context. And for Mr. Sanabo from Tanzania, I propose we speak about it outside, and I give you another contact on the SACOT because it's not really about climate action.
Okay, I'll try to be quick and just pick up what was said on human rights from the colleague from both ends and the Mary Robinson Foundation. Mentioning the example from the Netherlands, I think you gave us a hint that there is a lot more potential for using rights and human rights in this area of climate change. And I think there is more and more cases coming up all around the world, what we call climate litigation. So there are rights also, as Yves said, migrants have rights. I think there is a whole bunch of other rights, and you mentioned the procedural rights as being specifically important. There are rights that all of us as citizens of our countries might be able to use to bring the issue of climate change up to the public and to our courts. The problem, and also Yves mentioned that, is in many cases with states or governments not meeting their obligations, but that's where we probably can use this. And we can see it here during the negotiations, how important the aspect of participation is from, let's say, this international level of negotiations down to where climate action has to be grounded with the local people. Participation, or the right to information, participation can be crucial from this point of view for the implementation of what the Paris Agreement lays before us. So I'll leave it with that.
I think we all agree that the task before us is nothing short of a profound transformation of our economic systems, to secure our rights and to solve the climate crisis. But of course, the devil is in the details. So thank you all for joining us this afternoon or early evening to look at the details in terms of human rights, climate action, and land. Thank you very much. And I was told they need the room, so we need to get out of here very quickly. Thank you.
And also the reports are there.
Yes, I know. He's around. He's around. Yes, he's tomorrow afternoon in one.